Hi, welcome to the third installment of the series, Reading Literature, an Introduction. In today's video, I want to take us from what we talked about last time with dividing the world of literature up into different categories based on the genre, the style, the form of the literary work, into now a two-part video where we're going to talk about the different periods in the history of literature. This series, just to recap, is aimed at people who are intelligent and interested in literature, but for one reason or another don't have as much experience or knowledge on that subject as they would like to. It's meant as a basic guide to make literature simpler and easier to approach for people who are not fully initiated but are interested in knowing more. I think, as I've said before in the earlier videos in this series, that reading literature is a really worthwhile pursuit. It brings a great deal of knowledge and pleasure to experience profound ideas encased in very interesting and exciting stories as we get in great literature. And I think that the present events, while of course very unfortunate and destructive, do provide an occasion when people who are maybe having more free time than they previously had to get more involved in reading literature. So, as I said, today I want to take the second part of the task of dividing up this complex world of literature where there are hundreds or thousands of works that are considered major and important, and dividing it up to make it simpler to follow and understand for somebody who is not, have a degree in literature. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide up the history of literature into some basic time periods. And now I'm not going to go into all of the intricate little details that some literary scholars like to do, because I think that will overcomplicate things and not really aid the purpose of making literature simpler for you to understand. So I'm going to be making some divisions, some groupings that may be considered somewhat too broad or heretical or something like that to those who are really well versed in the field. But my mindset with these divisions is to create a framework that is actually useful and as simple as possible for the typical reader. Now, why do we even think about dividing it into the history of literature into time periods? Why are we not dividing it by some other means besides oh, these people wrote in the same era, so they go together? Well, there are certainly other ways to divide up literature, but I think that in terms of what is useful for the typical reader, dividing by time periods is useful because writers writing in the same time period can be very different from one another, but typically they have certain things in common in terms of the ideas that they're writing about, their basic approach, what they're thinking about in terms of who their audience is, the cultural background, which can be a challenge when reading older works, is obviously similar in a similar time period. The challenges that exist of all sorts when reading older works, culture, language, ideas that might be unfamiliar, are the same within or similar within a similar period. So reading something that is ancient Greek, even if they're very different ancient Greek writers, they have a lot of the same challenges when you're trying to approach them as a modern reader. And perhaps most importantly, there are real similarities between writers writing in the same period that make it more likely that if you like something from one writer in a period, you will be more likely to like another writer writing in the same period. So that's why I'm pursuing this idea of breaking things up into different time periods, different eras. So I'm going to discuss only Western literature in this division, these two videos. And that's not because I'm just dismissing non-Western literature as a whole. it's really because Western literature is my area of study. It's what I really know enough about to feel comfortable sort of speaking about it in a sort of quasi-authoritative way in public. And and also there's enough in Western literature to give you a ton of stuff to read and to be challenging enough that if we added in non-Western literature, it would be even more to break down. It'd be even more challenging. And again, I'm just not the person to do that video. So we're only going to focus on the West, by which basically more or less means Europe and America, the United States, North America, the United States, Canada, basically for this purpose. We're going to do Western literature, and I'm going to divide it into 7 basic periods, which again, some of which will scandalize those who would say, well, you can't put all of that together. There's a bunch of divisions in there. But for the purposes of the typical reader, I think it will be unified enough within a single one of the divisions I'm making. And I say there are going to be 7. I'm really going to focus on 4 out of those 7. The other 3 I'm just going to touch on. But the 4 that I'm going to focus on are, I think, the 4 that are going to be the most interesting and accessible for somebody who is newer to literature. And the other 3 I have less to say about, and I think have particular challenges that I will mention for each one of those that mean that you should probably put those to later until you have some more experience in the 4 that I'm going to mention. So in this first video, I'm going to talk about 4 periods, and then the second video, I'm going to talk about 3 more. The reason I'm dividing it into 2 videos is just simply that I think that this is, if I did it all in one video, it would be pretty long, and it would be a lot of material. So I want to break it up so that I'm not throwing too much at people in one go. One other thing before I start to mention, one other thing to mention before I start, for each period, I'm going to put on the screen, probably there, just a list of some of the major authors from that period. Some of them I'll mention while I'm speaking, and some of them I won't. Just, those are not going to be comprehensive lists, but they are going to give some idea of some of the big names for each particular period. So the first period I want to talk about is ancient Greece, ancient Greek literature. Now, this is already the first place where I might get some protest, because literature was not invented in Greece. There is literature that predates the ancient Greeks and comes from other civilizations, particularly Babylon with the Epic of Gilgamesh, but there are some others. However, I think ancient Greece is the first period where we get a significant output of literature that still holds up among the great literature of later eras. Ancient Greek literature is really the first literature where there are multiple works where I would say, yes, I would happily put that up against the best writers from our time. So ancient Greek is the first period I want to emphasize. Now, what are some of the major features of ancient Greek literature? Why should you be interested in it? What is there to look for in there? Well, I think ancient Greek literature is characterized by 2 major elements. One is a strong notion of heroism, which is often construed in terms of individual heroism, individual achievement, and creating a legacy for the individual hero. And on the other side, so there's heroism on one side, and the other side there's a strong sense of the necessity of tragedy. By that phrase I mean a sense that there is something in the universe that tends to lead human beings to an inevitable tragic result. So there are these 2 elements, and these elements definitely are somewhat at conflict with one another. You have these heroes who are fighting and they're achieving great things, but there's also these forces in the world that are working against the heroes and can tend to cause them to fall. And so most ancient Greek works really do have this very interesting clash between the notion of heroism, of ability, of possibility, of the possibility of achieving great things, and this notion that human achievement is fleeting and is destined to eventually fall into ruin. Now, most ancient Greek works have both of these elements and tend to lean to one side or the other, tend to have more heroism than tragedy, or tend to have more tragedy than heroism. So, ancient Greek literature, there are basically two major forms. We talked about the different forms of literature last time to look for in ancient Greek. Though there are some early novels that were written at that time, most of which we do not have, and there is some short poetry that exists, but you have to, of course, read in translation. The main two forms to focus on with ancient Greek literature are plays and epics. Plays and epics. Just as a reminder, an epic is basically a long narrative poem. Epic, of course, in ancient Greek, the major name in that is Homer, who is considered one of the very great early writers. Homer I would describe as the most heroic Greek writer. I talked about that tension between the heroic and the tragic. Homer has both, but he really favors the heroic more than any of the playwrights that I'll be talking about later. Homer, of course, has two works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Odyssey is the more accessible of the two works to the modern reader, and though I recommended in the last video that epic is something to leave for later, better to focus on novels and plays and then come around to epic when you have more experience, I do think it's worth saying that I think the Odyssey is the best first epic to read. If you haven't read any epics before, but you're ready to start, the Odyssey is where I would tend to go. So Homer is kind of the first and the greatest and the biggest name in ancient Greek literature. There are also a number of playwrights, and there are really four major ones, all coming out of the so-called Athenian Golden Age, more or less. Four major writers, three writers of tragedies and one writer of comedies. Now, tragedy in ancient Greek plays doesn't necessarily require a sad ending. It often does have a sad ending, but it doesn't necessarily require it. When we talk about Greek tragedies, basically that means serious plays, as opposed to comedies, not serious plays. And there are other divisions, but that's the basic meaning. And in ancient Greek tragedy, there are three major writers in chronological order. They are Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Now, all three of these are definitely worth reading. I think that Sophocles is going to be the most accessible one for the modern reader, and he's probably the best Greek writer to start with, period. If you haven't read any ancient Greek works, you're interested in the Greeks, you're interested in that civilization, as well you should be, because I think it's one of the most interesting and great civilizations of all of human history. I would say that Sophocles is the best one to start with. He's got, I think, a stronger connection with modern sensibilities. You're not going to read Sophocles and think, whoa, this is really foreign, I don't understand this at all. But he does sort of initiate you into what is different about Greek literature compared to more recent literature. Sophocles, I would say, is the one to begin with. He's the most heroic of the tragedians, I think. And then I would say Euripides is the one to read next. He is much more on the side of viewing fate and tragedy as an important factor in the universe. So I mentioned the three tragedians. There's also one famous comedian whose plays we have. That is Aristophanes. Aristophanes is wonderful, but I think is difficult for the modern reader, especially if the modern reader doesn't know a lot about the history of Athens, because so many of his comedies are dealing with events that were current events in his time. And so there's a lot of references to things that were going on that you just don't get the joke if you don't know some random Athenian politician from 407 BC. So that's the basic orientation to ancient Greek. I think it's it's one of the major four that I'm naming. It's definitely a wonderful literature to read. It's the easiest ancient literature, I think, to get into for the modern reader. And that's partly because a lot of later literature takes a great deal of inspiration from ancient Greek. And partly, I think, because it has such a strong heroic element, and they are concerned with creating heroes who actually very much resemble real human beings. And there's a lot of skill in characterization in ancient Greek literature. It's a really wonderful literature, and if you're interested in reading something that is very far out of our time and place and culture, ancient Greek is a great place to go. The next major civilization after the Greeks is the Romans. The ancient Romans, they conquered ancient Greece and adopted much of the culture. And I'm kind of combining Roman, this is heretical, but I'm combining the ancient Romans with the medieval period into this kind of 1,000+ year, actually 1,500-year era of literature. There are definitely differences between the Romans and the medievals, but what I would say about both as a whole is that they're very much more challenging to a modern reader than ancient Greek. And they both take a lot of cues, the Romans take a lot of cues from the Greeks, and the medievals take a lot of cues from the Romans. And this sort of cue taking makes it harder to follow if you don't know the preceding one, so it's harder to understand the Romans if you don't know the Greeks. It's harder to understand the medievals if you don't know the Romans. And also, I think there's just not as many great works that are going to be interesting to the modern reader from either the Roman or the medieval periods. Now, to speak about each one of these separately for a moment, the Romans, as I said, borrow a lot from the Greeks, and it's good to understand the Greeks before you read the Romans. Now, following on the Greeks, the Romans have epics and plays. The big name in the epics is Virgil. In the plays, there's Seneca, but there are others as well. But the Romans also have a lot more poetry that has survived. A lot of the Greek poetry is simply lost because it just didn't get transmitted over the centuries. But of course, Roman poetry is also in Latin, so if you do not know Latin, you have to read it in translation. There's good stuff in the Romans, but I don't recommend it for somebody who is relatively new to literature. I think the Greeks are a much better place to start. You get overall better works, and if you do become interested in the Romans, reading the Greeks first will prepare you to go to the Romans. Now, the medievals, I tend to sympathize with the view that the medieval period, by and large, is a period of cultural decline. It's a drought in history in that we have a lot more and better literature and other art, especially from before the medieval period and after. There is some good literature from the medieval period, but there are a number of challenges that make it just less accessible and less interesting to the modern reader. For one thing, the medieval era is a very, very religious time, religious in a way that even people who are pretty religious in modern society would still not quite be at the level of how religious the medieval period is. And literature in the Middle Ages was very heavily influenced by religion very often, and a lot of medieval plays, for example, there's such a thing as morality plays from the Middle Ages. These were plays that were basically just very heavy-handed religious sermons. They weren't interested in having good plots or characters or anything interesting like that. It was just about teaching some sort of religious message, which makes them very uninteresting on the whole. There are a few great works in medieval literature which tended to come up when somebody pushed back against religion or synthesized religion with another element and weren't so worried about teaching as they were about entertaining. But these great works are not particularly accessible typically to the modern reader because the medieval world is this very alien perspective. I think it's even more alien and culturally strange than ancient Greece, even though ancient Greece is earlier. There's a lot that's recognizable that basically modern culture is taken from ancient Greece that isn't recognizable in medieval writing. So medieval, again, is one, there are some gems, but I think that the typical modern reader is not going to be particularly interested by medieval stuff on the whole. If you become interested, I mentioned Virgil from the Romans, and I would also, Ovid and Horace and Seneca are the other kind of big names from the Romans. From the medieval period, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is really kind of one of the standout works in English literature, and of course the Divine Comedy by Dante is the standout work elsewhere. So if you're really interested in medieval and Roman, those are the places to go, but I really think it's not something I recommend for somebody who doesn't already have a really strong interest in those periods of history. Now, the next big period that I want to talk about is, this is the division that is going to stir the most controversy among people who have studied literature, the history of literature. It's really a period of about 350 years that I'm going to group all together under the label early modern. And this I consider to be range from about 1400 to the mid to late 1700s. Basically from the beginning of the Renaissance, which is historically the end of the medieval era in Europe, more or less, roughly speaking, to just the late 1700s, when we're about to experience kind of a new revolution in art and especially literature that is called Romanticism, and that I'll talk about in the second part of the video. So early modern literature, this is a big period that covers a lot of sort of different stuff. So in broad strokes, in the big picture, first I will note that the Middle Ages were very, very religious, and so much of literature was about just teaching a religious message. The early modern period is less religious than the medieval period, although religion is still a major factor in a way that it isn't in later works. So the reader of early modern literature has to be prepared to read a lot of stuff that has a heavy Christian element, but they aren't necessarily going to be preached at about some element of Christian morality like the reader of medieval literature will be. Early modern literature moves away from didacticism, from just trying to spread a particular message, to a very strong focus on character and psychology. This period has some of the greatest advances in writing interesting and intricate characters, getting inside the minds of characters, compared to the periods that came before it. Early modern literature tends to focus on character so much that I think to the modern reader, it will often be experienced as character coming at the expense of plot. A lot of the elements that go into plot are more of a later invention, a 19th century invention. Certainly early modern literature has plots and storylines, but it's not nearly as much of a focus as it is in later literature. So that's what we're focusing. We're focusing heavily on character in the early modern period. The other thing is, now early modern literature is a very international period. There are works that are worth talking about from this period of time in England, in France, in Spain, in Italy, in many parts of Europe. But in some countries, and I would say especially France, there is the element towards the later half of this period of a movement called Neoclassicism. And there's not much that you have to know in particular about Neoclassicism if you're not like a literary scholar. But the basic thing to understand is that Neoclassicism was where a bunch of scholars decided to write rules, strict rules for how you had to write a story. For example, they said that a play has to take place in a period of 24 hours or less, and it has to occur in a single setting, and all sorts of other things that are just sort of these arbitrary rules. And these can affect your understanding or your enjoyment of some of the, especially the later French works of the early modern period. Now, there is a great diversity of literature in the early modern period. It all shares some of the characteristics that I mentioned earlier, of intricate focus on character and psychology, religion being an element, but religion not being taught at you. But there is a tremendous diversity within those sort of broad strokes. They're all literary forms, for example. This period sees the last major epics, more or less, and the first major novels. And of course, plays and poetry existed before this period and exist after this period. So there's a broad diversity of things to read, and I'll just try to hit the highlights in each of these forms. First, plays, and of course the big name in early modern literature in plays is William Shakespeare. He is maybe the big name in Western literature as a whole. He is kind of the top attraction. If you are interested in early modern literature, it's probably because you are interested in William Shakespeare, or you're interested in seeing, who is he influenced by, who was similar to him. He's the big name. And so I'll try to give a brief orientation to Shakespeare because I know that there will be a lot of interest in him. I'm not going to go into every detail. That would require a whole series of its own on Shakespeare. But since he is one of the largest figures in world literature and one of the greatest writers in world literature, his reputation is pretty much deserved, I'll give a brief introduction. Shakespeare basically has three types of plays. He has tragedies, which are serious plays that do have tragic endings. That is a rule of the Shakespearean tragedy. Comedies, lighter, more humorous plays with happy endings. And he has plays that we can sort of consider in-betweenies, that have elements both of comedy and tragedy. Typically, they are more serious than comedies, but they tend to have a happier ending than the tragedies. That's basically it. There are, more intricate divisions that Shakespeare scholars like to get into, but that's the basic outline. There are strong works and works worth reading in all three of these categories, in the tragedies, the comedies, and the in-betweenies. Personally, I think that especially the modern reader will be more interested in the tragedies and the in-betweenies than the comedies. The comedies are a very particular sense of humor, which was apparently considered very hilarious in, the late 16th century, but is not always hilarious to a modern reader. There's a chance that you could read one of Shakespeare's comedies and just not really laugh at any of the jokes and kind of feel like, what am I doing here? Whereas the tragedies and the in-betweenies tend to deal with more universal issues, interesting plots, stories that are timeless, that you will find interesting even in today's times. So I would focus, if you're interested in Shakespeare, on the more accessible tragedies, which I will list one or two of in the video where I give specific recommendations, and on some of the in-betweenies. Particularly, I would name Measure for Measure among those. And that might, in fact, be the best Shakespeare play to start with, period. That's a controversial statement, but that's one that I would say. Other playwrights, because it's not just Shakespeare, there are many major French playwrights from this period. There's kind of three big ones, Pierre Corneille, Jean Racine, and Molière. Molière is a comedian. Racine and Corneille write tragedies or sort of tragicomedies, in-betweenies, those types. Of those three, I think that Corneille is probably the most accessible one. He writes these just very thrilling plots that are definitely worth getting into. But those are the three major names in French literature from that time period. Now to move from plays, and that's going to be the section I'm going to talk about the longest for this because Shakespeare is such a big name. Uh, Poetry is worth talking about in this period. I know that poetry is intimidating for a lot of people, but there's a lot that's really worth reading in this period. This is really the first era where you get English poetry that's accessible to modern readers without any sort of translation going on. A lot of big names. Shakespeare has a lot of great poems, short poems, in addition to plays. And the other big name I'd mention is John Donne, who wrote a lot of very interesting short poems. Both Shakespeare and Donne write a lot of poems with some really intricate psychological details, as well as a lot of very good love poetry. The other big name in poetry from this period, again, I'm focusing mainly on English poetry because I think that it's better to read poetry not in translation, and I'm assuming a primarily English-speaking audience, is John Milton. John Milton kind of writes one of the last major epics, Paradise Lost, which is difficult but wonderful, and he writes some other shorter poems that are also worth reading. Moving then to the novel. The novel is only just starting to become a major form during the early modern period. Believe it or not, prior to the 19th century, the novel was kind of considered a lower form of art. Kind of like the, special effects blockbuster of its time. Oh, you read novels. Okay. That, of course, changes over time. But it's really during this period that we get the first novels that are starting to stake a real claim to be serious literature and are starting to change people's negative perception of the genre. There are a number of novels from this period. Of course, the big name is Don Quixote by Cervantes, the Spanish writer. This is sometimes considered the first modern novel for various reasons. There are other novels that exist before Don Quixote, but it is one of the big famous works of literature, and it falls into this period. So that covers the very broad outlines of the early modern period. And at this point, I'm going to draw a line again because I don't want this video to become too overwhelming. I wanted to cover some periods here and then some more in the next video, just so that it's easier to digest. To quickly review, we talked really about 4 periods today, 2 main ones and 2 kind of subordinate ones. The big main ones were ancient Greek literature, which is, of course, from the ancient Greek civilization. We had epics by Homer, tragedies and comedies in plays. And we talked about the early modern period, the other major one, which is across Europe from 1400 to like 1750 or so. A lot of great plays, especially Shakespeare, a lot of poetry, including the first English poetry that the modern reader can really approach, as well as the earliest novels. And then the in-between periods, of course, I mentioned were the Roman and medieval, which have some gems but are less accessible to the modern reader. Next time, we'll move beyond 1750-ish into the 19th century, which I will spend a lot of time on because I think it is the most interesting and the richest period for literature, and I will talk some about the 20th century as well. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it worthwhile. Hope you've learned something from it. If you really enjoyed it, I'd appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, and share it. I would really hope to be able to inform as many people as possible and make it possible for more people to enjoy great literature. So again, thank you for watching. Thank you for giving me your attention for the space of this video and for this series, and hope to see you next time to talk about the last 250 years or so of literature. Thanks.